Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to Hendrix History Channel. Tonight we have a special treat for all of you history lovers, isn't that right, Sophia?
Absolutely. Tonight join us on a segment in which we will delve into the making of modern America. First, we will begin with World War I and travel through time until present day.
Hey Sophia, how do Americans make tea?
How?
They throw it into the harbor.
Well, let's get started. Here is an excerpt from the award-winning 1967 documentary, To Europe We Go, the story of Americans in World War I.
Thanks, Sophie and Roberto. I'm here with one of the first men sent to the front, Michael Keating. It's an honor speaking with you, sir.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
What did you think of the war in Europe?
Well, I honestly didn't care much. The war was a European problem, not mine. But then my old problem was working up the nerve to ask Guinea Miller to be my gal. No, most of us felt the same, though others thought we should get involved. Thought we had to help our allies.
How did you react to the deaths of 128 Americans on the 1915 sinking of the Lusitania?
1915? I could have sworn it was earlier. Excuse me. I can't remember exactly, but it was made a lot more people, a lot more eager to go to war. Though I guess it wasn't enough to convince President Wilson now, was it?
That's right. While anti-German sentiment soared as a result of the Lusitania, it wasn't until 1917, when we decoded the Zimmerman telegram to Mexico, that we declared war. What did you think of the Zimmerman telegram?
Well, we were pretty steamed, but mostly found it funny. Germans promising Mexicans to help them overthrow us? How did the Mexicans respond to it anyhow?
They rejected it slowly after America declared war.
Well, that's good enough. Those Germans must have been awful mad.
You enlisted shortly after that, right?
Yes, I did. One of the first in the block. Second I hear, I marched right down to get enlisted. One of the first to get sent over too. Still, remember when I got sent off? Everyone was there. Half the boys wanted to climb on the boat with me, whether they were in the army or not. Didn't know then. But then, that was the last time I saw some of them.
What was it like on the war front?
Let me tell you, by the time I got to France, I was itching to get out of there and make a name for myself. As for the trenches, they were cold, wet, and dark, like living in the gut of a monster, and twice as dangerous. Cost me some good friends. Lost some good friends. Anything else you want to ask?
So, where were you during the Treaty of Versailles?
Probably sleeping. Heard it was coming though. It wouldn't do us boys much good till it was all signed and done. When it was signed though, woo, that was one big party. And let me tell you, after my second day in Europe, I was more than ready to sing. Oh, we were. Ty Paris and hello, Ty good old America.
How do you feel knowing that you were one of the 4.3 million Americans sent over there?
4.3 mil. Woo! That's a lot. And how many died?
Well, roughly 126,000 Americans died, 234,000 were wounded, and 4,500 classified as missing. So around 350,000 casualties in total.
That many, huh? Always knew I got about the skin of my teeth. Never really thought about how lucky I was. 4.3 mil? I have to admit, most days I felt like my companions now were the only Americans left. 126,000? That's a lot of sons and widows. To me, there are about 200 deaths. About 100 from my unit, 50 from my school, and about 7 from the block. Calls for a lot more. Mrs. McCready. Lost both the boys, one after the other. Still lived like they were still there, baking cakes, buying presents. Said it made them feel more alive. pretending that they were Mr. Choke. He didn't even get to bury his son. Last he heard, he was taken prisoner, taken to some German camp. Then a letter came saying he was missing, with Robert missing, and a wife dead. Mr. Choke had nothing. Nothing to do, nobody to talk to. Us to just wait on reporters, sitting there waiting for a message. Just think, 350,000 U.S. casualties. We all thought it was the biggest war ever. So once it was over, of course we celebrated. We celebrated at least 3 years straight. Anything else?
Oh, no, that's all we needed. Thank you so much, Mr. Keating.
Please call me Michael. Anytime is anytime at all.
Of course. Thank you.
Good thing I had others waiting for me. Watching the little ones run, getting by my side, was one of the only things keeping me sane.
Back to you.
And now let's head over to the weather report.
Weather? I don't care whether the weather is hot or cold. I never leave the studio. Hey Sophia, what's a meteorologist's favorite reptile? A blizzard.
Okay, let's head over to the weather report. You're up, Chris.
The Dust Bowl was a period in time in which severe dust storms destroyed agricultural crops and greatly affected the nation as a whole. It started when devastating droughts began to strike in 1931, while America was still suffering from the Great Depression. This drought made the land dry and more susceptible to high and harsh winds. The Dust Bowl lasted from 1931 to 1939, a total of 7 long and exhausting years. The Dust Bowl truly began in 1931 with the beginning of the drought, killing crops and creating dry ground leading to dust storms or black blizzards. By 1934, the drought had spread, covering more than 75% of the country. The dust storms had also spread. On April 14, 1935, a devastating dust storm struck. This became the worst storm to occur and became known as Black Friday. 4 years later, in 1939, the drought would and leading to the end of the Dust Bowl as well. The Dust Bowl devastated America not only in land, but in spirit. The land was ravaged by the winds and drought, making it impossible for more crops to be grown. Because of this, those, such as farmers, who relied on the crops for a livelihood or whose homes and lives were destroyed by the dust storms, sought out refuge in states such as California. The Dust Bowl only added onto to the poverty from the Great Depression. To this day, people still look back and admire those who worked to survive and make a better life for themselves and their families. The novel The Grave of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck, was very famous because it showed what life was like for an average family and the strength of perseverance of the people. Back to you, Robert and Sophia.
How much do you pay and how many hours will I have to work? I just can't stand it here anymore.
We're rolling.
So, Mississippi gave Missouri a New Jersey. So what did Delaware?
What?
I don't know, Alaska.
We will now move on to the Great Depression.
In the period between World War I and II, America was having the best of times, otherwise known as the Roaring Twenties, which quickly changed into the worst of times. During the Roaring Twenties, life in America was a haze of post-war euphoria. Jazz was swinging and money was flowing, especially from the stock market. Even if you didn't have enough money to live a lavish life, with credit you could pretend. All this changed on October 24th, 1929, Black Tuesday. It is believed that the Great Depression began with the stock market crash of 1929. This collapse of the stock market prices on the New York Stock Exchange had a terrible effect. During the next 3 years, the prices fell even further. The stock market crash harmed individual investors as well as financial institutions and banks. By 1933, 11,000 of the United States' 25,000 banks had failed. The Great Depression raised unemployment levels, and by 1932, 12 to 15 million workers were left without jobs, which was about 25 to 30% of the workforce. After the Great Depression, the The instigation of government action with taxes, public works, social insurance, social welfare services, and much more ensured economic stability in many of the nations around the world. We will now move on to World War II.
As Adolf Hitler took the position as Chancellor in 1933, he took advantage of this position to start the Nazi state. As Nazi beliefs spread throughout Germany and Hitler's dictatorship grew stronger, Germany sought Europe domination alongside Japan and Italy. The United States maintained their neutrality until Japan provoked them to be involved in the war. It was December 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, which marked America's full involvement in the war. The Japanese failed to destroy the entire Pacific Fleet, and instead of creating an opening for the advance, they awoke a powerful new enemy. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was no question. The United States was going to war. On December 8, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan. Due to an alliance, Germany declared war on the U.S. The next day, the American government knew that this would be a costly war. The help funded, they began to sell war bonds. Many efforts were given by the American population, and in the end, the United States raised around $185.7 billion. In the end, they were able to end the war by forcing the Japanese, the last standing Axis power, into surrender with the new atomic weapon. The Paris Peace Conference ended on February 10, 1947, with the signing of many peace treaties, officially ended the Second World War. World War II impacted the U.S. by giving women and blacks more freedom. Women gained the right to work outside their houses, and blacks were able to get better education. Since most men were fighting in the war, they had to leave their work behind, which left the women with this responsibility. African Americans not only received better education, but they also had duties in the war. They worked in transportation and armory units.
Well, that was fascinating.
Yes, it was. Now let's move on to Cold War. In it, we will talk about...
That reminds me of a joke. So a polar bear walks into a grocery store.
The Cold War was an international crisis in 1948 that arose from the attempt by the Soviet Union to force Western Allied powers to abandon their post. During this war, an Iron Curtain was formed, which separated the West and the Soviet Union. The eastern part of Germany was under Soviet control, and that made this part of Germany communist. The Soviet occupation forces in Eastern Germany began a blockade of all railroad and water communications between Berlin and the West. In response to that, the United States and Britain began supplying the city with food and other supplies by airlift on June 26. The airlift kept life going in West Berlin for 11 months until the Soviet Union lifted the blockade in May. The creation of Glasnost weakened the bonds that held the Soviet Union together. With the dissolution of the USSR looming in February of 1990, the Communist Party was forced to close its 73-year-old monopoly on state power. The freedom of press and dissent that Glasnost offered eventually led to the Union's component republics to announce their autonomy from Moscow, with the Baltic states withdrawing completely from the Union. The impact this had on the United States was that it made them have a strong disapproval towards communism, and Americans feared the communist political view to the point where McCarthyism was created. The Cold War also impacted Americans by making them fear war and economic instability. Since the Cuban Missile Crisis, Americans feared that the Cuban missiles would hit the United States. In terms of economy, taxes would go up when the U.S. was at war. These were the main reactions of Americans after the Cold War.
The Civil Rights Movement was a movement that focused on ending segregation and discrimination against African Americans and the other minorities. The tension of racial discrimination had been bubbling beneath the surface for centuries, although it wasn't until the 1960s that civil rights became prominent in mainstream America. The most well-known act of protest was when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man. This refusal led to the year-long Montgomery bus boycott, After the Supreme Court ruled bus segregation unconstitutional, Parks became a national hero, and Martin Luther King, the man who successfully led the boycott, became a well-known civil rights activist.
King led a successful career, and using his nonviolent approach to protest, was able to convince many people to fight against segregation. This career was ended, however, on April 4, 1968, when King was shot and killed by Ray Rice.
The civil rights movement led to several changes in legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which did not allow discrimination based on race. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 allowed any race to vote. Then in 1967, interracial marriage was legalized.
The impact on Civil Rights Act of 1964 today shows us the true spirit of American democracy in the United States. One of the many impacts from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the election of our president today, President Barack Obama. This act allowed equal employment rights that changed thousands to millions of lives then and now. However, racial discrimination is still a tangible danger for many African Americans, and there have been several recent instances of police brutality in recent years.
A carrot, get it? A carrot!
Haha, right, okay, let's move on. That was some great commentary, wasn't it?
It sure is sad we're nearing the end.
Right, for our last two topics, we will be exploring the elections of our history and the war on terror.
Well, let's get going.
Over the course of U.S. history, there have been 56 elections, with 44 presidents, including our current president, Barack Obama. We will touch on some noteworthy presidents and their contributions. George Washington was the first president of our country. He influenced many to support the Constitution, established policies and organization. Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States. He led America through the Civil War and the constitutional and moral crises that came with it. Next up is Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president. He is known for his conservation accomplishments and his work to regulate corporate monopolies, which earned him the nickname Trust Buster. The 28th president was Woodrow Wilson. He led America through World War I, wanting to ensure democracy for the world. He also developed a program of progressive reform and asserted international leadership in building a new world order. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the only president to be elected 4 times. He led the United States through the Great Depression and World War II. He also expanded the powers of the federal government through a series of programs and reforms known as the New Deal. John F. Kennedy, the 35th president, was most known for his civil rights activism, space race contributions, and the prevention of a nuclear disaster. After 2 years in office, he was assassinated in 1963. Richard Nixon was the 37th president and the only one to resign the office due to his involvement in the Watergate scandal. He is most known for his work with China and the USSR. Ronald Reagan, the 40th president, is credited for his help in ending the Cold War, especially tearing down the Berlin Wall.
September 11, 2001 started out as any normal day. Children went to school and the adults to work, many of them in the World Trade Center. However, before lunchtime it was obvious to everybody that September 11, 2001 was a day that would go down in history. Out of 4 planes filled with 19 members of the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, as well as countless civilians, 3 of them hit their targets, the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. In the wake of more than 3,000 deaths, George Bush declared a war on terror. Bush had several objectives in the war on terror, such as helping weaker countries keep from resorting to terrorism, defeating famous terrorist organizations, and to eliminate the poor conditions that can lead to terrorist thoughts. To aid this war on terror, several bills were passed by Congress and President Bush. The most important new bill was the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Terrorists Act, or AMUF, which stated that the American government could use its military to attack those responsible for 9/11, and that force against nations, groups, or people who in any way abetted terrorists. The effects of 9/11 are still felt today, especially through increased air security and government monitoring.
Well, that wraps up our intriguing segment on U.S. history.
Thank you so much for tuning in.
And now a word from our sponsor, the ever so supportive Mr. Hendricks.
Thanks, guys. That was really great. I enjoyed that very much. But that reminds me of another one. If April showers bring May flowers, what do May flowers bring?
What?
Pilgrims. It's a joke.
I guess the rest is history.
Oh my, why did I tell you all those little lies? I temporarily lost my mind when all you've been to me is so kind. Oh my darling, sometimes you're so good to me and too kind. You're far too nice for me and oh my, what am I gonna do with you? What am I gonna do with you? Me are really the same, but you don't join in with my games, and I know you'll be on your way if I don't find something else to play. Oh, you, me are really the same, but you don't join in with my games, and I know you'll be on your way if I don't find something else to play.
Isn't that right, Sophia?
Absolutely.
I'll try to pull myself together. It feels like the sun is shining.
So a polar bear
Oh, I don't. Sometimes you're so good to me.